Good day, class. This is going to be a follow-up lecture to the lecture that I posted online last Sunday, I believe. Now, I want to apologize for the last lecture. I know that I actually posted two in the email, one being an older lecture that concerned another class. It was another American history class here at Roane State. The other one that I posted was the lecture that I had made for you guys, but for some reason the computer program screwed up, deleting the actual lecture, leaving only the video of me talking about it. That's why I posted both of them, because I actually believe the lecture I did for you guys was actually a better performance on my part. The problem is it was not synced up with the PowerPoint slides. And I hope you guys understand me not wanting to re-lecture again, especially since it took me an hour and 50 minutes to do that lecture. But hopefully these two lectures got points that I want to get across. Now, this lecture is going to be fairly short. We're just going to look at the rest of the world during the 1920s, especially the 1930s, set the stage for World War II and American involvement in the war. Because to lecture American involvement in the war, really understand we have to lecture about all of World War II from the start in 1939 to the end, of course, in 1945. So, beginning with this lecture, we're going to include more about what was going on in the rest of the world than just what's going on in the United States. So, let's get started. To understand what's going on in Europe during the time period, we have to go all the way back and revisit the Versailles Treaty of 1919. We have to understand the German position during this time period. Now, if you look at a map here, we see that Germany is going to not only lose territory, Alsace and Lorraine, this area right here called the Polish Corridor, but the Versailles Treaty also stipulates that Germany cannot have an air force, cannot have a navy, and their army must be no more than 100,000 men. Now remember, in 1918, the German military stood over 3 million men strong. It had one of the largest navies in the world. It had one of the best air forces in the world. And here's the thing that you've got to remember. When this treaty was signed by the German provincial government, the provisional government, German troops were still here in France, not in Germany. Now they'd been forced back in the latter part of 1918, but they were still here on enemy territory, at least in their eyes. So the Versailles Treaty is humiliating to the German people. The Germans cannot understand why they must bear the brunt, why they have to sign a war guilt clause claiming that they are solely responsible for the war and thus have to give up territory and also pay the Allies reparations. They believe that they've been sold out. During the 1920s, especially the 1930s, there is this stab and back myth that it was not the German military that failed. It was not the German people that failed. Instead, Germany was betrayed by bankers, by dissident political groups, and again, something that the Nazis will latch on to. They were sold out by an international Jewish conspiracy. Now, provisional government of Germany is not the same government that Germany had before World War I. Germany before World War I had a Kaiser, a king. However, Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicates just prior to the armistice going into effect in November of 1918. This leaves only the German Parliament. Now, the German Parliament had existed before World War I. It, of course, passed funding bills and tax bills, but it was not the head of the government. That was Kaiser. The Kaiser was the head of the military. The Kaiser was the head of the government. Now, this provisional government, this new government, is the best way to put it. And so the rest of Europe is in a state of flux. As we look down here at the rest of the map, we see that countries like Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Yugoslavia, Romania, these countries right in here, which were originally part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, well, they're new to the scene. But we also see a new country over here, the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, of course, is Russia, but a communized Russia. Now, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which had ended the war between the new Soviet Union and still in the war Germany in 1917, gave Germany all of its territory right here. Now, of course, after World War I, the Allies were not going to let Germany keep it, but they did not want to give it back to the Bolshevik Soviet Union. So instead, they divided it up among the ethnic groups that had been there before: Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and of course the Poles. The Poles, of course, had historic claim to this area because Poland had existed back in the 1700s only to be divided up between Germany, Austria, and Russia. And Poland is reconstituted partially here with German territory. Now, right in here, just above where it says Polish, this area is known as the Polish Corridor. This area right here is mainly German in ethnicity. However, the reason why the victorious allies give Poland this territory right here is not only to create Poland, but to give Poland access to the Baltic Sea, because without the city of Danzig right here, they would not have an open water port. It would be landlocked. So keep this in mind. Now, what about Germany in the 1920s? Well, when the war ends, Germany is falling apart politically and socially. You see political upheaval here in the port cities. Merchant and especially naval personnel are mutinying. They are mutinying and they are seizing the cities and port facilities. Many of these merchantmen sailors have been radicalized by communist agitators. The communists have also been at work here in southern Germany. In 1919, or actually, sorry, in November of 1918, communists celebrating the first anniversary of the communist revolution over here in the Soviet Union declared the Free State of Poland. The Democratic Party of Germany, which is a communist party, seizes control of the large Lander, well, their version of a state, the German Lander of Bavaria. Now, the German government, this new German government that is being forced to give up its military, has very few resources and very little money to deal with this. And so the German government, this provisional government, makes a deal with the devil. Because when the war finally is over with in 1919, you have all of these troops that are coming home. They're being mustered out of the army as part of the Versailles Treaty, but they find an economy that, well, they can't find a job. Germany has been utterly, completely destroyed. Well, not physically like World War II, but it's been destroyed socially and especially economically. And thus they form gangs known as Freikorps. Freikorps literally means free army in German. And so these Freikorps become effectively the law in many German cities. And so the provisional government makes a deal with these Freikorps to help them bring Bavaria back into the fold. But as I said, this is like making a deal with the devil, because they effectively bring Bavaria back. They put down the communist uprisings in the cities. But then on March 13th, 1920, some of the Freikorps, under the command of a fellow by the name of Wolfgang Kapp, K-A-P-P, seized Berlin. They gained control of Berlin and tried to install a right-wing government. The provisional government is forced to flee Berlin, fleeing to the resort community of Weimar. Now, this is a crucial time in German history, because at that moment, the provisional government was hammering out a new constitution to make Germany more like the Allies in terms of how they run the show. And of course, this does not look good. If you're an average German, how do you view your government when they're ran out of the capital? Now, of course, the provisional government is finally able to come back to power. They're forced there. They bring the Freikorps to heel. However, this new government that becomes known as the Weimar government, because the Constitution is signed in Weimar, has this stain, has this stigma of being weak, indecisive, and powerless. Powerless in the face of stronger internal enemies. Now, Germany politically is in tough straits during the early 1920s. We see hyperinflation. We see the economy not doing well. Germany is really hard off. However, in the mid-1920s, the U.S. government will actually step in to help Germany. The vice president under Calvin Coolidge, a fellow by the name of Charles Dawes, will negotiate a plan whereupon the U.S. government guarantees loans to Germany to help it pay back reparations to France and Britain, but also stimulate its economy. This becomes known as the Dawes Plan, D-A-W-E-S, the Dawes Plan. Now, This is also important for you guys to understand, because this Dawes Plan rejuvenates the German economy, but it's built on continued influxes of American loaned money. So you have this cycle. American banks, guaranteed by the U.S. government, are giving money to Germany. Germany then keeps some of it to stimulate its own economy, to back up its own economy, but a large chunk of it goes to pay back the British and the French, who in turn have to use the money to pay back the very banks that had loaned Germany the money in the first place, because they're having to pay back the loans that they took out for World War I. Now, at least under this system, under the leadership of the new Chancellor, Gustav Stresemann, law and order is returned. The economy in Germany is stimulated. And at least between 1924 and 1929, Germany appears to be the the best economy out there. France is sluggish, Great Britain is sluggish, but Germany is going great. However, just like in the United States, the stock market crash of October of 1929 destroys all of this, because when the stock market crashes, those American banks cut off the loans to Germany. This means that the British and the French continue to demand their reparations, even at a faster rate, because their economies are being hurt by the Great Depression. And the Germans do not have this influx of fresh money. So overnight, the German economy collapses even worse than the American economy. Excuse me. In 1929, well, to put it bluntly, the Germans no longer use their own money. The Deutschmark hyperinflates. This means that German workers will demand their paychecks, not just daily, but at lunch and at quitting time, because they run out during their lunch breaks in order to give money to their wives so that their wives can go and buy food with it, because if they wait until they get off from work, the prices will almost be double. German housewives will use the German money to light their kitchen fires with, to light their heating fires with. It's so worthless. And what does this do? Well, excuse me, guys. I'll be right back. One of the beauties of doing online lectures is you have access to your own kitchen. Got a tick in my throat. Well, what I was getting at is the people that are hurt the most are Germany's middle class, the people who make an economy go, because hyperinflation wipes out their savings. It makes their savings worthless if they leave it in the banks, and many of them, of course, have to spend all of it as the prices for food, for housing, for fuel skyrocket during 1929 and 1930. Now, what happens? Well, this new Weimar government appears to be powerless. Germany at this time was a multi-party system, and instead of solving the problem, the liberal parties and even the conservative parties, they just simply blame each other. And they fight back and forth, kind of like our government is doing right now. But nothing gets done, and the Germans are desperate for a solution. The solution comes in the form of a new political ideology, fascism. Now, fascism is a hard ideology to tack down. One of the problems with fascism is it comes in so many different flavors. So I'm going to kind of give you fascism light. What is fascism in general? Fascism is a perverse form of corporatism. Corporatism is a political ideology that stresses a strong central government, a government that regulates all economic aspects. Excuse me. Now, the fascists believe that the problem of modern government is twofold. First, they reject traditional values. For example, they reject the traditional view of nobility or monarchy, but they also reject the new ideas of liberal democracy and individual rights. Instead, fascism takes from corporatism the idea that society is the most important element, that the national whole is more important than the individual. And how do they define the national whole? Well, the national whole in the idea of fascism is not based on class like communism. It's not based on religion. Instead, it is based on nationality and ethnicity. This is why fascists tend to be racist to some degree. Now, of course, the Germans become incredibly racist, but not all fascists are as racist as the Germans were under the Nazi regime. However, this idea that society is defined by racial or ethnic characteristics, and that the government represents this whole, and thus the body, the political body is that of the ethnic group, is heavily ingrained in fascism. And likewise, like corporatism, they favor a strong central government. Now, the very first fascist state was not Nazi Germany. It was actually Italy and Spain. The Italians are the one that actually coined the term fascism. Fascism comes from the Italian word fascisti. Now, fascisti is the symbol of power in ancient Rome. Centurions and leaders often carried these staffs made of multiple sticks, small little sticks, bound by a leather strap. Usually a hatchet was also included in this bound grouping of sticks. Now, the symbolic nature of this symbol is this. We, as individuals, are these individual sticks. These individual sticks can be snapped. However, if you take these individual sticks, everybody, and you bind them together with the power of the state, they are collectively stronger than they are individually. That if they are subsumed by the whole, they are strong. This is why the Italian fascists take as their flag the fascisti. So if you look at the Italian flag of World War II, right in the center of the flag, in the white, is this fascisti, this bundle of sticks. Now, the Italian fascist movement gets its start with this man right here. This is Benito Mussolini. Now, Mussolini had been a socialist before World War I. Now, of course, socialism is the belief that the body as a whole is not defined by ethnicity or race or religion. Radical socialists, like communists, for example, define the group by their class. During World War I, since this was a battle of nation states, Mussolini abandons his fascism in favor of a new ideology that is similar to fascism. That's why fascism, or not fascism, but abandoned socialism, that is similar to socialism. That's why fascism and socialism are not polar opposites. They are actually closely alike. The big difference being that fascism is based on nationality. And since, of course, this was a war based on nation states, Benito Mussolini becomes a fascist. Now, after the war, he returns and becomes a political journalist, using his journalism as a way of spreading his fascist beliefs. Now, Mussolini, actually, it's kind of funny. Mussolini gets his political start with the help of the British, because he is actually a failed journalist, an editor. His paper, which is a fascist paper, is not doing too well. And beginning in 1919, Mussolini starts to receive aid from the British government. The reason for this is too complex for us to get into. I just thought you would find this interesting, that the enemy of one of the enemies of Great Britain, one of the allies of the country, Germany, that almost conquers Britain, well, the leader of this country, fascist Italy, gets his start with the help of the British. But this will catapult Mussolini into politics, so that by 1922, in October of that year, Mussolini's new fascist party, with its own paramilitary organization known as the Black Shirts — these are men, usually young men, whose uniform is a black shirt — will march into Rome. They will march into Rome in a show of power. This is not a military coup. They don't seize power. This is mainly a political march. This, what becomes known as the March on Rome. However, it has the desired effect, because in 1923, Mussolini's party is elected into power, and Mussolini is appointed as prime minister. And as such, of course, he will start changing the Italian government along fascist lines. However, the fascist state that we are most aware about, of course, is the German fascist state. Where does Germany go from being this liberal experiment of the Weimar Republic of the 1920s, this experiment that seemed more liberal than even Britain and France, leading to many individuals to flee their home countries to the cities of Germany because it seemed to be a freer society? How does it go from Weimar Germany to Nazi Germany? Well, Hitler is, of course, the man most associated with the National Socialist German Workers' Party. That's what Nazi actually stands for, because Nazi is actually a German acronym for the Nazi Party, which is, again, the National Socialist German Workers' Party. To give a little background of Adolf Hitler, Adolf Hitler was actually not German. He was Austrian. He's ethnically German, but in terms of his nationality, in terms of his political nationality, he was born an Austrian. He would immigrate to Germany just prior to World War II. He is a failed artist. He has no formal education. He believed World War I to be the final determinant of who in terms of the nation states, who's going to be the dominant nation state in Europe. And of course, when Germany loses in 1919 and is forced to accept the Versailles Treaty, Hitler believes that it is not a failure of the Volk, the German people, V-O-L-K, the Volk. But instead, he buys into this stab-in-the-back myth. He believes that it's the liberals, the communists, and most notably, the Jews. However, returning home after World War I, he is a man without a mission. He stays in the military and is tapped by the Weimar Republic, this liberal government, to spy on radical elements in Germany at that time. And he is assigned to spy on what was then known as the DAP, the German Workers' Party. Now, the German Workers' Party was strongly anti-Jewish anti-socialist, anti-communist, but also anti-capitalist. And most importantly, they were anti-Semitic. The German Workers' Party advocated a strong government to rebuild Germany. And this actually is something Hitler was already a believer in. So the irony of history is that Hitler was exposed to a group that he would come to lead by 1921 by the very government that he would set out to destroy. And so one of the things that Hitler does, of course, is he rises through the ranks of the German Workers' Party so that he enters the higher echelons of its leadership. He becomes the leader of this renamed party that he will rename the National Socialist German Workers' Party, so it becomes the NSDAP. Hitler designs the party's new banner, which is a red field with a swastika in the middle of it. So Hitler actually comes up with the Nazi flag. It's during this time period that Hitler refines his speaking abilities. However, early on, Hitler viewed the Nazi Party as a guerrilla force. And in 1923, Hitler will stage what becomes known as the Beer Hall Putsch, or Beer Hall Revolt. This is an attempt to mimic Mussolini's March on Rome, to challenge the German government. So in November of 1923, Hitler seizes, and I'm not saying that he does this alone, he leads his Nazi members to storm the beer hall, or actually storm from the beer hall where they were using it as a headquarters, to storm the Bavarian War Ministry and overthrow the Bavarian government. They are met in the streets by the German military. Shots are exchanged. Hitler is arrested. But instead of being put on trial for treason, he is jailed. And he's jailed for less than a year. It is during this time period that Hitler will refine his views of what the National Socialist German Workers' Party stands for. He will write these down in what becomes the best-selling book of the 1930s. One of the best-selling books of the 1930s. I even, not to say that I am a Nazi, but I actually own a copy right here. This is an English copy. Mein Kampf. I have read this. I will not say that I agree with it. I will tell you this is like mental torture to try and read this book. But it refines and coalesces many of Hitler's complaints, many complaints that Germans share with Hitler. And so when he leaves prison in 1925, instead of trying to build a guerrilla party, Hitler starts to transform the Nazi Party into a political insurgency, a party that will work within the system to destroy the system. And so by 1933, the German, or the National Socialist Party, has seized power, not by force, but by the vote. They've seized power because in the German multi-party system, the National Socialists, the Nazis, have garnered enough votes, enough positions within the parliament for them to be a force. And Hitler will politically ally the Nazis with the conservative Catholic Party in Germany and have himself named Chancellor by January of 1933. So what does Hitler start to do? Well, in a lot of ways, his early policies mimic those of FDR. About the little break right here, guys. Had to take a phone call. One of the problems of doing things at home. But getting back to our discussion, Hitler's initial policies are kind of similar to those of FDR. Many of them are make-work projects. For example, one of the ones that is still quite evident in Germany today is the German Autobahn. The German Autobahn was a way to not only put Germans to work, but also to tie Germany together, to stimulate the economy in multiple ways. He changes the currency, gets rid of the overinflated Deutschmark, and replace it with the Reichsmark. So many Germans, at least initially, not only look upon Hitler favorably, but he is like their savior. But behind the scenes, Hitler is maneuvering Germany toward not only an authoritarian state, but a totalitarian state. Behind the scenes, Hitler is changing the government so that it is constantly in a national state of emergency, centralizing all power under him and the Nazi Party. All trade unions, all government associations are either eliminated or made directly part of the Nazi Party. And then finally, all police forces are directly controlled from Berlin. This means that you don't elect your sheriff, if this was here in the United States. You do not have input over your chief of police. These are officials that have to be okayed from Berlin. And then finally, fascism at its core is a paranoid form of nationalism, and this is introduced into Germany. So what do you get out of this? You get a totalitarian state. So to understand Nazi Germany in the late 1930s and of course during World War II, we must understand what totalitarianism is. Totalitarianism differs from authoritarianism in that those that want a totalitarian state do not just want to have political power, to not just control the economy. Totalitarianism, as its name infers, want to have total control over every aspect of your life, to have total control over you. They want to control not only what you do, but what you think. In a totalitarian society, there is always an enemy. Whether it be the capitalist for communism or the Jews for Nazis, there is always somebody that is trying to destroy the national whole, to break it up, to destroy it, to stab it in the back. And thus, there needs to be a savior, a messianic leader or group that will step in to protect the national whole. In the case of Nazi Germany, of course, this was the Nazi Party. The party not only is the group that will be the savior of the national whole, it will become ingrained in society, ingrained in politics, so that if you as an individual want to get a job, if you want to work in government, if you want to get a license to be a doctor or a lawyer, you must be part of the party. You must be a member of the party. If you guys can remember the first couple of minutes of the movie Schindler's List, I'm pretty sure most of you have watched the movie. Oskar Schindler is, he's a businessman. He's kind of a shyster. He's, kind of a man on the make. But he's laid out his clothes. He's laid out the gifts that he's going to take. And the last thing that he puts on is a lapel pin. A Nazi Party lapel pin. Because Oskar Schindler, the man who had become synonymous with saving Jews from the Nazis, was a Nazi. He was not a Nazi because he believed in the ideology. He was a Nazi because in order to have access to government officials, to have access to other businessmen, to have access to the very corridors of power, he had to be a member of the party. Because the party either takes direct control of or co-ops all aspects of business, all aspects of media and communication. For example, one of the things that Hitler and the Nazis will do in the mid to late 1930s is that they will ban all radio stations and newspapers that are not directly controlled by the Nazi Party, in order to keep Germans from listening to radio stations outside of Nazi control, outside of Germany itself. They will introduce in 1937 this right here. This is a Volksempfänger, which literally translates to people's talking box. The Volksempfänger is a radio that is hardwired only to receive certain stations, so that the Germans can pass laws that they do in 1937 that outlaws the ownership or manufacture of any radio other than a Volksempfänger. So the Germans, the Nazis will tell the Germans, hey, we've got a brand new radio, a stylish Bakelite case, high tech. Just turn in your old radio and we'll give you one for free. And of course, they do. They take control of or co-opt religion and clubs. Like, for example, the Boy Scouts are banned from Germany in the 1930s, replaced by the Nazi Party equivalent, the Hitler Youth. Religion is co-opted by, well, if you toe the line of the Nazi Party, we'll give you tax credits. If you don't, we'll tax you out of existence and we'll put your priest or your clergy in jail. And then finally, something that we've already mentioned. They will take direct control of the police and they will co-opt the military. How do they co-opt the military? The one organization that could have stood against the Nazis. Well, the military and many of the military leaders believed that they had been sold out by the liberal Weimar government, that they had been forced to surrender while still on enemy ground. Hitler promises them that if the military leadership supports the Nazis, Hitler will invest heavily in the military, build up the military, and regain Germany's place as a military power in Europe, and thus co-opt the military. While at the same time, the Nazis will be building an alternative military known as the Waffen-SS. Basically, the Waffen-SS is armed just like the army, but controlled directly by the Nazi Party. So what is America's response to this rise of totalitarianism in Europe? Well, Americans still want to stay out of what's going on in Germany. Isolationism is still running high in the 1930s. Instead, in the early 1930s, the American government under FDR will declare its policy of concentrating on the Western Hemisphere. It's during the early 1930s that the FDR administration follows what it calls a good neighbor policy of building up and revisiting relations with Latin American countries and rebuilding trade with Latin American countries. In the mid-1930s, the United States government will declare a non-interventionist policy in both Europe and in Asia. In 1935 and 1936, the U.S. Congress will pass what become known as the Neutrality Acts. The Neutrality Acts simply state that if war were to break out anywhere in the world, U.S. businesses and banks could not either give loans or sell munitions without the express consent of the U.S. government. Now, where do these Neutrality Acts come from? Well, these Neutrality Acts come from what becomes known as the Nye Committee hearings. Gerald P. Nye, the U.S. congressman, let me see if I can find you where Nye is from. One of the benefits of having access to the internet here, so let me Google Gerald P. Nye. Actually, he's from North Dakota. He is one of the senators from North Dakota, and during the Nye Committee hearings, which were held in 1935, the U.S. Congress comes to the conclusion that America was tricked into World War I. Not just tricked by the British and the French, but by American bankers and American munition makers. And thus, the Neutrality Acts are an attempt to keep America from being tricked into war again. Now, this means that officially, America is not going to get involved in wars overseas. However, this does not mean that Americans individually cannot act on their own. We see Americans getting involved in the conflicts in Europe, most notably in the Spanish Civil War. Now, the Spanish Civil War begins in 1936 when Spanish General Francisco Franco, a fascist who was in command of Spanish forces in Spanish Morocco, crosses the Mediterranean and invades Spain proper. Between 1936 and 1939, Franco's nationalists will battle the Spanish Republicans who stand against him. In the end, Franco's forces will win, but during the latter stages of the Spanish Civil War, the so-called international brigades will help the Republican side. These international brigades come from various places in the world, most notably the Soviet Union, because most of the support for the Republican side will come from the communist Soviet Union, international communist, and socialist. And many of the Americans who go to Spain to fight on the Republican side will not only form up into what becomes known as the Lincoln Brigade. Many of them are American leftist, American socialist, and even American communist. And many of these Americans will come back disillusioned by America's inaction to help the Spanish Republican government when it falls in 1939, because it falls not from its own the strength of Francisco Franco's forces. By 1939, the Italians and the Germans are sending military aid and, quote, volunteers to use this military aid. The Spanish Civil War effectively becomes a proving ground for the Luftwaffe and German and Italian forces. While this is going on in Europe, or while this is going on in Spain, another crisis is developing in the center part of Europe. In the summer of 1938, Hitler starts to demand territory from Czechoslovakia. Because at the end of World War I, let me see if the map back here has political boundaries. Yes, we do. At the end of World War I, these countries, Austria, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Poland, Yugoslavia, the northern parts of Romania, and down here, Serbia, or I should say not Serbia, but Albania, are chiseled out of the Austrian Empire. Now, as I've already mentioned, the Austrians are ethnically Germans. You also have ethnic Germans located here on the Czech side of the German-Czech border. This is the so-called Sudetenland. The Sudeten Germans are ethnically the same as, well, Germans. And Hitler claims that the Sudeten Germans are being persecuted and marginalized by the Czech government. Hitler argues and demands that the Sudetenland be turned over to Germany. Now, Hitler has an ulterior motive. It's not just that the Sudeten Germans live here. Most of the Czech munitions factories are located in this area of Czechoslovakia. Likewise, this is a very mountainous region, whereas the rest of Czechoslovakia is very flat. The Czechs have fortified this boundary, this border, and if they are forced to turn this border over, they are turning over effectively the wall that they have built up between themselves and Germany. However, the French, and especially the British under Neville Chamberlain, want to avoid war at all cost. And so in September of 1938, Chamberlain and his French counterparts force the Czechs to agree to what becomes known as the Munich Agreement. The Munich Agreement simply states that the Czechs will turn over the Sudetenland in exchange for a promise from Hitler that this is the extent of his territorial claims. However, shortly after the Munich Agreement goes into effect, Hitler will seize this area right here, leaving only Slovakia to be a, quote, independent but still puppet state of Germany, effectively destroying Czechoslovakia. Now, while this is going on in Europe, Japan is on the march in Asia. Let's see, get back to my notes here. There we go. Beginning in 1936, Japan had been at war with China. In the early 1930s, Japan had moved into Manchuria, seizing it, creating a puppet state that they called Manchukuo. In 1936, the Japanese will, well, let's put it this way, they will maneuver the Chinese in what is today Beijing, back then they called it Peking, into firing upon Japanese forces that are stationed in Peking, initiating a war between China and Japan. A war that Japan is ready for, China is not. By 1937, Japan has seized most of the Chinese coast and moved inland so that by December of 1937, they have seized the nationalist capital of Nanking. After seizing Nanking, the Japanese soldiers go haywire. They riot, raping and murdering without control. This becomes known as the Rape of Nanking. Thousands of Chinese citizens are raped, butchered, murdered. Some are used for bayonet practice. It is during this time period that some of the first photos of World War II atrocities come out, because to the Chinese, World War II does not start in 1939. It starts in 1937. So here's Europe as it exists in 1938 and early 1939. As you can see, those governments in purple are democratic parliamentary governments. Those in tan are dictatorial governments. The question becomes, how is this war going to start? Because by late 1938, many believe that Chamberlain's claim of peace in our time is a pipe dream. Well, the war starts over, again, territory and ethnic populations. Again, going back to the map here. In the summer of 1939, a year after the Munich crisis, the Nazis under Hitler start to claim that this area right here, especially this area right between Germany and East Prussia, where Danzig is located, needs to be turned over to the Germans, back over to Germany. It is traditionally German. And they start rattling sabers over it. Now, I'm not saying that the Poles deserved what they got, but one of the things that we must recognize is that the Polish government was not a democracy. It was not a liberal republic. It was ruled by colonels, by the military. And the Polish military, of course, could not give this territory up without losing face and possibly losing power. The British and the French will support the Poles, the Polish government. The hope The hope by the Germans and the British is not that the Poles can stand up on their own, but that the threat that Germany poses to Poland would also be a threat to here, to the Soviet Union. Because while both countries are dictatorial, totalitarian regimes, Nazi fascism is violently opposed to Soviet communism and vice versa. The belief held in Germany and France in the quarters of their leadership is that the Soviets would never allow the Nazis to be right on their border. And the hope is that the threat of a Soviet counter-invasion to counter the Germans would keep the Germans in check. However, the problem is this. Behind the scenes, secretly, the German foreign minister, a fellow by the name of Ribbentrop, has been in secret discussions with his counterpart, the Soviet foreign minister Molotov. In late August of 1939, they signed what becomes known as the Nazi-Soviet Pact, or the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. What is made public on August 31st, to the chagrin of the British and the French, what is made public is a peace agreement that neither side will go to war against the other. But what the British and the French do not see is a secret agreement. The secret clause of the Nazi-Soviet Pact basically green lights a German invasion of Poland, because as soon as the Germans invade Poland, the Soviets will invade, and they have already decided how they're going to divide Poland up. The problem for the British and the French is that they have already promised publicly to defend Poland in the case of invasion. So when Germany invades September 1st, 1939, this forces the British and the French into a war they wanted to avoid. Now, next class period, we will pick up talking about the phony war and the German invasion, or the German invasion of France and then later Russia. But this is the situation as it exists in September of 1939. I hope you guys enjoyed this little short lecture, and I will see you guys tomorrow night. Peace.